All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a pretty wild collision. On one hand, you have the incredible multi-billion-dollar expansion of the U.S. Space Force. And on the other, you've got the public's rapidly growing demand for transparency regarding UAPs. We're going to map out how the military is essentially building this massive, high-tech net to monitor absolutely everything in orbit. And, well, what happens when that net catches things we simply can't explain? Here's how we're breaking it down today. Organizing the space domain, funding the future fight, space domain awareness, and finally, transparency and the unknown. Starting off with Section 1, Organizing the Space Domain. It's honestly fascinating to watch how these two worlds have evolved side by side. On one track, we have these historical unknowns, right? You go from the 1968 Minot Air Force Base UFO case to the famous 2004 USS Nimitz incident, all the way up to those explosive 2023 congressional hearings. But running completely parallel to these mysteries is a rigid, highly structured march of military advancement, which culminates in today's Space Force and its massive research and development budget planned for fiscal year 2026. Establishing a rigid organizational structure for space is actually deeply historical. If we look back at early military planning documents, the U.S. Army wasn't just thinking about terrestrial launch sites, they were already outlining requirements for fully operational orbital stations and even lunar outposts. The military has always viewed space as a domain that requires absolute control and deep organizational structure. Fast forward to today, and those early lunar ambitions have evolved into highly specialized outfits like the National Space Intelligence Center, or NSIC. Built to be this lean, agile enterprise, it answers directly to the Space Force's Director of Intelligence, Surveillance, and Reconnaissance. Their sole focus? Analyzing foreign space and counterspace threats to secure our modern assets. Moving on to Section 2, Funding the Future Fight. When you dig into the fiscal year 2026 Space Force budget for research, development, test, and evaluation, the scale is just staggering. They are pouring millions into IT, data analytics, and digital solutions specifically to enable high-speed decision-making in hostile environments. We're literally talking about funding research for speed-of-light protection and many-on-many engagements. The goal is to prevent any sort of technological strategic surprise from adversaries. And to actually build those capabilities, the Space Warfighting Analysis Center is aggressively funding things like multi-domain sensing and spectrum warfare architectures. But here's the crucial part. A group known as the Joint Sensitive Space Staff, or JS3, is tasked with modeling and simulating satellite signatures. They are figuring out the exact thresholds of detectability. Basically, they're learning precisely how to spot, track, and categorize absolutely anything hiding in orbit. But it's not all just modeling and simulations, right? The Space Force is actively putting real, tangible hardware into orbit to test these limits. For example, the Space Systems Command is spearheading a partnership with NASA to demonstrate a new sensor, the Compact Ocean Wind Vector Radiometer, or COW-VR, directly on the International Space Station. So they're constantly putting new, incredibly advanced eyes in the sky. Which brings us to Section 3, Space Domain Awareness. All of this, the organization, the massive funding, the new hardware, it all really serves one primary, overarching operational goal for the Space Force: Space Domain Awareness, or SDA. It requires the military to effectively identify, characterize, and understand literally any factor, whether active or passive, associated with the space domain that could impact our security. Why does this matter? Because it means the military is mandated to build a sensory net so tight that absolutely nothing in orbit goes unnoticed. So this brings us to a really fascinating crossroads. Think about it. If the Space Force is heavily funded and structurally designed to characterize every single object in space, what happens when a multi-billion-dollar sensing apparatus captures something it simply cannot identify? That leads perfectly into Section 4, Transparency and the Unknown. A recent academic study by Bastos and Duarte highlights a pretty messy reality about all this. Genuine scientific inquiry into UAPs, unidentified anomalous phenomena, is deeply complicated by history. The study explicitly notes that the UFO community has historically been targeted by sustained state-sponsored disinformation campaigns. These were designed to blur fact and fiction, manipulate public perception, and subvert genuine accounts. It's actually really striking to see these organized obfuscation tactics formally documented in academic research.
But as you probably know, that conversation shifted dramatically after the July 2023 congressional hearings. We had retired Navy Commander David Fravor testifying about the 2004 Nimitz Tic Tac encounter, and Major David Grush testifying under oath about withheld evidence of non-human aircraft. We are now seeing high-level military insiders, literally the very people operating within these massive intelligence networks, pushing for modern disclosure. And if we look at the current state of disclosure, the political backdrop is shifting rapidly. Just look at early 2025. An executive order declassified historical records regarding high-profile assassinations, but it specifically excluded documents related to UFOs or UAPs. Shortly after, the U.S. Counter-Foreign Information Manipulation Office was closed. Online communities track these actions incredibly closely, viewing them as real-time data points as the public pushes for the release of Space Force sensor data. So this brings us to the core finding of that Bastos and Duarte study, and it reveals a really powerful sociological truth regarding the space domain. On one side, withholding data and stonewalling fuels this destructive cycle of conspiratorial paranoia and erodes public trust. But on the other side is the transparency effect. Their data actually showed that when the government engages directly and provides genuine disclosures, it measurably calms the waters, it subsides disinformation, and it supports rigorous scientific inquiry. Transparency actively counters the erosion of trust. I want to leave you with a really powerful concept from this research. As the Space Force continues to fund and launch these incredibly advanced sensors, they are inevitably going to gather undeniable data on the unknown. The researchers note that true disclosure brings ontological shock, the transformative fracturing of our worldviews. So the ultimate question for us is, if the transparency effect holds true and the Space Force reveals exactly what they're seeing out there in the dark, are we prepared as a society for the shock of finally understanding the unknown?